Hello and welcome to Mother Tongue, the podcast where modern motherhood meets real life. I'm Marianne, founder, podcast host, and mum of three, and I created this space for all the mums who are juggling it all. From toddlers and tantrums to businesses and burnout, we're talking about what it actually takes to build a life, a career, and a family all at once. Here, you'll hear honest, unfiltered conversations with founders, freelancers, experts, and everyday mums about work, wellness, identity, mental health, relationships, and everything we carry that no one talks about. Hit follow, join our community, We Are Mother Tongue, and tune in for real talk that supports the whole you, because modern motherhood is busy and no one should do it all alone.
I'm so incredibly excited to welcome Stefanie O'Connell to Mother Tongue. Stefanie, how are you?
I'm well. How are you today?
I'm surviving. So actually, do you know what? I lie. Today has been a really, really good day. I feel like the first day in a long time. I feel like I've had a very productive day. I've got lots done. I'm feeling quite calm and quite on top of my life, which doesn't often happen, probably because I've taken my ADHD medication, which I don't always do. It's probably the reason why. But yes, I feel like I'm having a good day. How about you?
Wow, you're so speaking my language. I haven't taken mine yet, but it's early in the day here in New York City, so I'm just getting started. We'll see how it unfolds, but I hope I have that kind of day ahead.
Yeah. You're going to. Like it's the day. It's the day to have a good day. Stefanie, I'm so excited to have you on today. I think before we get into all things, can you please start by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a journalist and I have covered personal finance for over a decade. And as I've been covering money and specifically women's relationship to money, their access to money, their unique roadblocks and experiences in building wealth, I've been really interested in understanding a lot of the stories we tell about why women have less money than their male peers. And oftentimes you hear these things like women are just less confident, women aren't as interested in building their wealth, they're not as aggressive or competitive, or they're just opting out. And what I really found in not only my reporting, but my research into these stories about why gender inequality is so persistent is that a lot of these ideas are built on false assumptions. The idea that women don't ask for more, as opposed to what the data show us, that women do ask for more. They do lean in. They are confident, but they remain less likely to get what they ask for. Not because they're doing something wrong, but because they do not get the same responses when they practice the exact same behaviors as their male peers. And that really started me down a rabbit hole of research to understand how this change in how the environment responds to women, as opposed to women's behavior in and of itself, really shapes different outcomes. And that's true across metrics of wealth. It's true in the workplace. It's true in the home. It's true in every aspect of our lives. And so I went down a rabbit hole of this research, as I mentioned, and started writing my book, The Ambition Penalty, to really expose the data that demonstrate this and the data that show us what really changes that unequal response.
It's sad though, isn't it? It's like I was actually listening to a podcast on this today. It was actually a podcast that Oprah did with Emma Grede, because Emma's obviously recently also launched a book. And it just really got me thinking how unfair it is. And I'm like, how can we change this? Like genuinely. I mean, obviously that is a big question for me to start with. And I really like you've built this career around money, power, and ambition. At what point were you like, I really need to write this book, I really need to put this out in the world, we really need to change this narrative? Like, why is now this time that we're really going to open up this conversation?
Well, I was hosting a podcast, Meta, and I was interviewing women about their money stories, their secrets, the things that had happened to them. And what I always found in this kind of like personal confessional style of reporting was that you would see the disconnect very clearly between the prescriptive money advice and then how women experience putting that advice into practice, and the way doing all the right things did not generate the outcomes that were expected. So in this one episode, I was interviewing a woman who was working in tech, and she was following all of the best practices in terms of advocating for herself, in really making sure that she was adding value to the company, being able to communicate her value to the company. When she was offered a job, she negotiated her salary. She'd even taken a negotiation course in college. And despite implementing all of those best practices, not only was she not given what she asked for, but her job offer was rescinded for even negotiating in the first place. And at first, she completely blamed herself, because what have we always been told? The worst they can say is no, right? That's always what we've been told. And when you are told that, what happens is you internalize, you self-blame. You think, if the worst they can say is no, and not only did they say no, but they actively retaliated against me, then you think, well, there must be something really wrong with me then. I must be bad, unworthy. And she just went into this internalized cycle of self-blame, only to find out that 3 of her close friends had had the exact same experience. And again, we don't really talk about this. We don't really hear about it. Now, to be fair, I'm not saying this is totally common, but it is not entirely uncommon, and it is a distinctly gendered response. And what I found when I was looking deeper into her story was a whole bunch of research that shows us that this is actually not an anomaly. It's a statistical reality where women implementing, again, the exact same best practices, not only less likely to get what they ask for, more likely to be retaliated against in the process. Now, it's not always quite so severe, not always having a job offer rescinded, but sometimes it's just being labeled difficult, not a great fit, unlikable, bitchy, all of these words that ambitious women are probably unfortunately familiar with. And those labels, unfortunately, have compounding consequences over the course of a career. Even if it's not in a single moment of a job offer being taken away, it might be in not being considered a team player, and so not being a part of the group that gets selected for mentorship and the best opportunities and for advancement and promotions and leadership consideration in the future. And time again, when you dig deeper into this, you just see these double standards popping up at every single level, from hiring to negotiation to mentorship to promotion, in ways that compound over the course of a year, 5 years, 10 years, so that by the time women are in midlife, they're facing pay gaps that have already doubled over the course of that time. And that's when, a lot of us have children. And so then when it comes time to decide, whose career is going to get prioritized, you often wind up having women in a position where they're already so underpaid and so under-recognized that they wind up having to scale back, not necessarily because that was their preference, but because they're so unable to access the rewards that their male peers can access and the support that their male peers can access to be able to combine their personal and professional ambitions more sustainably.
So before we get on to how us as women, as a nation, as a world, can fix this fundamentally awful problem, why do we think this has happened? Like, why? I mean, obviously, we talk a lot about on Mother Tongue about how like this phenomenon of modern motherhood, how we're up against so much all the time. Back in the 80s, not that long ago, women were staying at home more. Men were going out, they were making the money. Women were looking after the house, cooking, looking after the kids. And that was the norm. And then we fought really, really hard over the last, however many years to have the space to be ambitious, have the space to work, have the space to build a career, to build a business, to do what we wanted to do. However, we're carrying all this, but we're still carrying everything in the house. We carry everything. And I mean, I'm lucky I have a husband who is willing to help, who's willing to learn. but I know I'm not the norm. And I mean, it's like his brain is just not wired in the same way. It's like he's a bit like forgets things. He doesn't understand what a to-do list is. He's a bit like, I'm only human. I can't do more than one thing at once. Like, how, as women, the clearly superior being, sorry for any man who's listening to this, how have we got ourselves into this position where we're having to fight for what we deserve and we're being undervalued at every corner?
Yeah. So I just want to be very clear that this is not women's fault.
No.
What women are experiencing is not a problem of their own making, but that is what we've been told it is, right? Even when you think about what we're being told are the barriers to our success, whether it's confidence or assertiveness or ambition, all of that really teaches us that the biggest barrier to more of what we want is ourselves. When in fact, the biggest barrier to what we want are these double standards in the world around us. And to your point, a total lack of support. So the norms and expectations of women have really shifted over time. They've become much more expansive, and that is a good thing. That is saying that, to be a woman, you are expected certainly to be kind and compassionate and caring, but we also are able to access some professional rewards. There is an expectation that women will be in the paid labor force, that they will be able to act in earning capacities. However, when it comes to positions of real power and leadership and management, the expectations of that really haven't changed. Those expectations are overwhelmingly, and these are not typically spoken out loud. They're usually implicitly held beliefs. But when you measure people's beliefs about what a manager or what a leader or a person with real power and authority looks like, it's overwhelmingly male. And it's an idea of men should hold power and women's labor is acceptable so long as it is to support men's power and leadership and management. So women's labor in the home does that, and it can in the workplace too. And I think where you really see this is where you've seen a real shift in women's outcomes is at the entry level. You see it in education, where it's really about potential of power as opposed to power in and of itself. And then you see it at the entry level, where women's labor is really just used at the ground floor to support so much of the management and leadership structure. But as soon as you go up into that first step of a position of power, a position of management, a position of authority, you see the gaps start to open up immediately. Again, no matter how much more qualified women are, no matter how much more educated they are, no matter how much more ambitious they are, you see these gaps come out. And that really is the result of a norm for leadership that hasn't changed, even as the norms for what women are expected to do have shifted slightly. The other thing is that the norms for men have not shifted.
No.
Men are still expected to cut themselves off, essentially, from their compassion, from their care. And basically what that leaves women doing is carrying at least two full-time jobs between the home and the workplace without having access to meaningful support from spouses, fathers, brothers, because the men in our lives are still expected to conform to a model of masculinity that says to be a provider is only to dominate financially and not to actually provide caregiving labor and household labor and the actual support needed for all of us to be able to integrate our personal and professional lives more sustainably. And so much of women's burnout, I point out in this book, is really driven not by them wanting too much, but rather by these support structures and norms that do not give them the same supports that their male partners do in integrating those ambitions. And I wound up writing a whole chapter on this idea of having it all and work-life balance and how frequently those discussions are had among women, and yet almost never had among men. And one of the reasons for that is so much of what women are being told is expecting too much, which is really just the ability to combine a career and family life, is something that's already automatically implicitly assumed for men to be able to have access to no matter what. It's not even a question of whether those things will be mutually exclusive. They don't say, if you have kids, how are you going to have a career? It's irrelevant, because men not only have those two things, but they also have more free time than women. So that's another part of the conversation that I want to be really clear about. And when I talk about these themes, I want to bring in data that reframes the way we're talking about it. The fact is, men have more work-life balance and more time for personal leisure and hobbies than women. And they have more access to power, resources, and professional opportunity, which tells us that the real barrier to women having these things is not their professional ambitions. It's the support structures that men are getting and women are not.
I mean, it is like it's terrifying to think how much has to change for this to change. That's what blows my mind in this whole conversation. Like, you know, in some ways, lots has changed, and it's great to see how far we have come. But bringing it back to, you know, men, for example, to start off with, I mean, women having the right to work in the positions that they most definitely deserve to work in is a whole different conversation. But for men to step into a place where they support more across the board, how can we start shifting that? Like, does that start with us as mums? I mean, I have 2 small boys. Like, how is it something that men are learning in society? Is it something that they're learning at home? Like, how can we start to shift this entire narrative so the next generation are not having these conversations?
I want to cite 2 really fascinating research papers on this. The first is about the division of household labor so when we're talking about household labor, we're talking about cooking, cleaning, certainly outdoor chores too that are masculine coded. But even when we include all of the feminine and masculine coded chores in a household, oftentimes, actually the vast majority of the time, women are still carrying much, much more of all of that, usually 2 times as much as their male partners. And this is true even when women work more and earn more. And the research is very, very clear that those are dynamics that are learned by children. By the age of 4, children learn to perceive an inequitable division of household labor as fair. And the best predictor, one of the best predictors of children's gender role attitudes, basically these ideas of what it really means to provide or what it means to be a man or a woman in the world and the expectations upon them. One of the best predictors of boys' attitudes is how much household labor they see their father doing. So when you have a father who is actively engaged in childcare, in household labor, that child 10, 20 years later, more likely to also engage in household labor and caretaking, more likely to be married to a woman who's in the paid labor force. And then that father's daughter is also more likely to marry an egalitarian partner or partner with an egalitarian partner. And she's also more likely to be in the paid labor force and reach positions of management and leadership. So just in terms of the power dynamics we model in the home, and I think it's really important to frame household labor in terms of a power dynamic and not a logistics issue, because again, if it were a logistics issue, it wouldn't play out so consistently across gender lines, even when it doesn't make sense, like even when women work more and earn more. So I think if we are keeping in mind that we are modeling power dynamics and whose needs are being prioritized and whose needs are being supported in ways that are mutually reinforcing, as opposed to one person constantly being prioritized at the expense of another, children pick up on that and they reproduce that in their adulthood. So that's the first study. Second study was a study of what determined whether fathers took paternity leave. or their full allotment of the leave to which they had access. Now, the best predictor of it was not their own beliefs about gender norms. It wasn't what their partners believed, so what the women they were married to wanted. It was what other men in the organization did. So no matter how progressive they identified, or no matter how much their partners wanted them to take leave and be present in caretaking, none of that mattered as much as what those men saw other men at the organization doing. And if those men at the organization took their leave, they would more likely take their leave. If they didn't take their leave, they wouldn't take their leave, even if they think men should take leave, and even if women want them to take leave. And so I think that really tells us the challenge that we're up against is a culture in which you're really playing, men are really playing essentially a status game with one another and trying to out-masculine each other. And it's often coming at our expense, at the expense of our own needs, at the expense of their own needs even. Fathers who maybe want to spend time with their children and feel like they can't because nobody else is doing it. And I think we really have to get to a place where men need to be willing to pay that cost, because that is right now what happens is instead that cost gets shifted entirely onto women and onto children, and then we model that for these next generations. So I think this is really a call to shape norms and to understand that these norms are not about these individual dynamics like me versus you or man versus woman. It's really all of our ideas of what we've been conditioned into believing a good man or a good father is, or a good woman or a good mother is. And unfortunately, the ideal of motherhood is still basically a complete self-erasure, complete self-sacrifice. Whereas for men, it's really the opposite, where it's like a doubling down on this idea of getting ahead no matter what the cost is to their children, to their spouses. And that's an ugly thing to confront, but I think it's necessary if we're going to be real about changing it.
Yeah, it's so true. And I mean, look, so we've talked now about how we can maybe change the way our children are seeing us act as parents in the home, and that is a very good point, and that is very important. What we see a lot of here, and it's not necessarily the norm, but it is more normal than it might be in other parts of the world. Families might relocate to the Middle East, and the men have come for a job, and the women, a lot of in our community as well, women who have small children, they are mostly at home. And these women, they might have a bit of a side hustle or a passion project that they're working on, or they might work part-time, but they're not bringing home the bacon, as it were. And as a result, I have plenty of friends whose husbands, because they bring in the majority of the money, basically think that that's their job. That is all they have to do, and they don't need to do anything else. And the wife, because they feel like they need their husband to bring home the money, and they need to not be paid by them, but they need the money coming in so they can still do the nice things that they do, they allow their husbands to go off and, don't get me wrong, I think everyone is allowed to have their hobbies, but what I'm saying is it's not equal. The husbands they do what they want when they want to, and then that time that they've had for themselves is definitely not reciprocated, because they're a bit like, well, I've earned this money, this is my money, I'm facilitating. But I would like to challenge any man really to swap roles for a moment, because I know for one that when I go to work and I'm in my work mode, I find it a hell of a lot easier working than I do raising children. That is just the reality.
Agreed.
Love my kids, love them, but it's testing to a whole new level that I don't think men really understand.
Yes. And I also want to point out that the data is quite clear that men who earn half as much as their wives do as little household labor as men who earn twice as much. So again, the money is a really easy thing to point to and say this makes sense. I would even challenge that framing. I don't think just because you earn more money doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility to show up for your family with your time and your labor. But even then, even if they don't earn more money, the pattern stays the same. And so what I'm really trying to expose here is, again, this idea of a power dynamic and whose interests and needs get prioritized. And the way you see this play out is basically the justifications for why, quote unquote, this makes sense, the dynamic you're describing. Just the goalposts move every single time that you point out, even when women earn more, this is still the dynamic. And then you'll get men say something like, I work longer hours. And then you could say, okay, well, when women work longer hours, they're also still doing more. They're also having less access to leisure. And then they'll say, well, that's because my job is less flexible. And again, statistically, women have less flexibility, still do more household labor. And then they'll say, oh, well, my job is more dangerous, or it's just more exhausting, right? And it just goes on and on and on. You're moving the goalpost. And what eventually you realize is that at the end of the day, the data doesn't matter to somebody who believes that they just do not have to show up and really work in mutual partnership, and they actually just want a relationship based on this very fundamental idea of my life basically staying the same after having children, and your life basically changing completely to accommodate that. One of the most fascinating things in the research, and this is really true across many countries, even those that are kind of identifying as progressive, is men's time use stays almost unchanged following the birth of their children. So, there's this rhetoric of the provider dynamic, meaning the assumption that men earn more money and that is their contribution to the household. But if your life doesn't change in any meaningful way after having a child, you're not really providing anything. You just have a job. Your life would be the same whether you had a child or not. And so I think we really have to deconstruct these ideas of what it means to be a provider and what it really means to add value and to show up. And this is not to say that money doesn't matter. Of course it matters. And I have a lot of empathy, by the way, for women who are in a situation where they're really trying to get their partners to confront these dynamics, and they are in a position where it can be challenging to have these conversations with somebody because you do feel powerless. You think, well, who am I to say anything because I don't have access to the finances. I don't have an income. And there is a real risk. I want to be very clear. Like, when women are hesitant to push back in these situations, it's because women are subject to greater risk. They can have men lash out. They can have men withdraw even more. They could have their financial resources withdrawn. And that is a really scary reality, especially when you're the primary caregiver of children. So I think you do have to assess your safety in pushing back against these ideals when you're trying to have these conversations with partners or peers. For women especially, like, we're always at heightened risk just by virtue of being women in the world, particularly in terms of intimate partner situations. But if you have that sense of psychological safety and physical safety in your home, I think it's really worth reframing all of these conversations away from logistics and into power dynamics in terms of whose needs are constantly being prioritized and whose constantly are being sacrificed, because that really exposes how much the money or whatever it is just winds up being a cover for this totally uneven power imbalance.
And is there any way that you can suggest like this conversation is broached, or like the exercise is done to really kind of start inserting this into households?
Yeah, so I like to depersonalize this. It's really hard to talk about these things when it sounds like it's a you thing, it's a me thing. Yeah. And let's reframe what we're experiencing within the broader experience of what heterosexual marriages or partnerships look like, and gender roles around, motherhood and fatherhood, particularly contextualized wherever we are. And then have a conversation about like, is that the vision that we're trying to conform to, like what the norm is of mothers or fathers in this dynamic? Is it serving us? Is it serving our children? What about that do we want to adopt, and what about that do we not want to adopt? And I think really thinking about it more in terms of an institution and how we make marriage or partnership or parenthood an institution that aligns with our values as a couple, as opposed to saying like this is just about dirty dishes and you never doing them, because then you're just kind of getting into a dynamic where it gets into defensiveness, it gets into like you and me, but it's really not. Like it's these much broader things that again we've been conditioned into since the time we were born, seeing our family dynamics. And I think when you think about these things institutionally, it allows you to understand where those norms come from. It allows you to unpack the history. It allows you to reflect and say, actually, I grew up in this dynamic. It's shaped my expectations, but it certainly didn't work for my family, and I don't want to reproduce it in this family either. And I think it's about being able to have those bigger conversations. And I do want to say that this is not a guarantee. In fact, probably more often than not, the dynamics don't shift, unfortunately, statistically. So I just want to say, like, it's not a guarantee that the conversation is really going to move the needle, but what it can do is inform you of what's really changeable in your relationship and if it is changeable. And that's useful information to know, because what's happening is a lot like in the workplace, where when women face backlash, basically they're taught to blame themselves. The same thing happens in the home. They think, well, if I just asked more sweetly, or if I made the list this way instead of that way, or use this calendar app or scheduled couples therapy, well, then I could like crack the code and my husband would become a different person who steps into partnership. But oftentimes it's just not the case. If you're willing to have a partner who's going to earnestly engage in this kind of dialogue and dynamic that we're talking about, like thinking about this institutionally, then I think you have some hope. But I think if you encounter resistance consistently over time, every time you try to bring up these more broad ideas and conversations, then I think you really have to come to a place of acceptance and then thinking how you're going to move forward. Is that something that you are okay with? And if it's not, and if it is, how can you build your life more sustainably, knowing your partner won't change? Again, that's something every person is going to have to confront for themselves. And if they are not okay with it, then like that's a different conversation. But I do think what I want to affirm is that this is a big deal. Like, yeah. I know we reduce this to, again, an idea of like, well, it's just about dirty dishes. Like, I don't want to really create friction in my marriage over something so silly. But this isn't about dirty dishes. This is about how you spend your life, your time, whether it's valued, whether you are able to access the rest you need, the money you need, the care you want to be able to provide your children, the way you want to show up in the world for yourself, your kids, for other people. So it's really fundamental to the human experience, and I just want to respect how hard it is, and also like extend a lot of empathy, because we are really up against something that is quite entrenched, and
True.
And there's a huge benefit to men, and they're not going to be really jumping to give that up.
No, but I think, us having, our generation having these conversations now will hopefully make a difference.
I hope so.
Future generations. And I will also say, if your partner is not willing to have a conversation with you about this, then maybe they shouldn't be your partner.
Yes. I agree, but I know it's a hard thing to hear.
Yeah,
so.
Yes. But I think the other thing that has worked really well for us, and I think I say this without sounding too patronizing, but I genuinely believe men are wired differently to women. They just are. The way we see things versus the way they see things is just very different. And I don't know whether that's something that's ingrained or an upbringing thing, but in my household anyway, it's just facts. Now, I have come to learn that building up resentment and then lashing out when it hits a point has never worked for us. So if, again, you're feeling resentful, don't pick the moment to have a conversation about this when you're feeling extra resentful, because it won't come out in the right way. And when you're not starting this kind of conversation on the right foot, I feel like it's just destined for disaster. The other thing that we found really helpful in our house is we've circled areas of responsibility, let's call it. So, for example, food is my responsibility, and I very much own that space. So I do all the supermarket shops or orders. I'll schedule what the kids are eating, what we're going to eat, and organize all that side of things. If I ask him to do a job, like this is a list, order it, he will do it, but he's not responsible for it. He isn't responsible for healthcare. So if a child needs a vaccine or go to the doctors, or there is an emergency at school, it's on him. He is the leader, and the boxes are so clear that we know there's no room for if but what. It's like this is your job, and I feel like men respond quite well to that. That's helped quite a lot. Is there anything in your life that's worked really, really well that you can share with us as a tip?
I have really become very firm about putting the resources and boundaries I need in place, such that even if something does fall apart on my partner's end, I still can do what I need to do. I think I'm glad to hear that this has worked well for you, but statistically, it's not working well for many women. Because
That's sad.
I know it is unfortunate, because we do have all these strategies, and in theory they work. But what often happens is you do all this labor, you wind up dividing these chores, and yet when it comes time, I interviewed a woman for my book, and she was talking about how she was like, okay, let's delegate. This is all your responsibility, and not just, the actual physical task, but also the tracking of the task, the task in full. So she had delegated trash to her husband to try to just balance something out in the household. And then he said, well, where are the trash bags? And she said, well, that's part of your responsibility. And he said, well, how am I supposed to know where they are? And she said, well, I've been doing it, so I'll let you know now, but now you're going to track this responsibility. And he said, okay, but what kind of trash bags do I need? And like, you're just seeing how inane these questions are, right? Now, to your point about like wired differently, this man was a doctor. Like, if he showed up with that level of incompetence in his job, he would be fired. So he's not incapable of this. I think it's just showing the level of entitlement to women's time, labor, and their expectation that they should be the ones to manage this. And if you try to delegate it to men, they will make it, in many cases, not always, so painfully difficult that it will feel like it's not even worth it. She even said at one point that she was just trying to like get through this conversation without losing her mind, understandably. And she said, these are a very specific size of garbage bag for the size of the trash can. So, let me know when you start running low, and then I'll show you where you can go and order them. And he said, I don't know how I'm supposed to know when the bags are getting low in the box. And it's just like, you would not accept this from a 3-year-old. Like, my daughter can figure this out, right? And she's a toddler. It's the trash bags are on a roll that gets smaller over time. You know when you're running out because the roll is getting smaller. Meanwhile, this guy's a surgeon. And I just want to validate that, yes, let us try to do all the right things, all the best practices, delegate. It's not saying it's not worth trying to do those things, but I just want to validate that if this is still happening for you, you are not the exception, you are the rule. And unfortunately, that is going to require a much, much bigger shift in attitudes of responsibility. And feeling like, okay, if you are assigned a job in the home, it is as important as and requires your labor to the same extent that a job in your workplace requires. Because if men were acting this way at work, there would be no men in paid labor forces.
God, it's such a large, nuanced conversation, and there's so much that I want to say about it. I feel like I'm not going to have time. I'm not going to have
I know. It's deep. We could go deeper and deeper and deeper.
Oh my God, so deep. But okay, so let's say women are coming out the other side. So I would like to think I'm a relatively ambitious woman. I'm lucky because I have a husband who he does support me.
Yeah.
And I have the space to be ambitious. Let's say it. To be fair, I don't really give him an option. It's not really ever a conversation we have. It's more like, I'm doing this and bye-bye. But we are extremely lucky in the sense that we have a great support system where we live here in Dubai. And so it allows us to both work. And I'm fully aware that not everyone has that. But let's say a woman is listening to this. You know, she knows she's finished having her kids. They're still small, but there is a bit more space now. How can ambitious women start to kind of claw back it, as it were, that space and time for them to be able to work and that balance to become slightly fairer?
Well, I think to your point where you just said, you know, if I'm going to pursue my ambitions, and so the world around me has to shift whether we agree to it or not. You know, that's what I'm saying about if you're always just relying on one person in the form of your husband, you might be waiting a long time before you get space for yourself. So think about what happens if that never changes. I'm saying, yes, let's work toward changing it, but let's not count on that changing before we allow ourselves the space to do the things that we want, that we need, quite frankly, in our own lives. So we're not completely, you know, self-sacrificing forever. So assume nothing changes. What do you need? What childcare? What support structure? What community? I think a big piece that we have really overlooked in terms of thinking about getting more of what we want is the collective element of it. We have really atomized ourselves into this idea that every intervention has to start from within us and in ourselves and by ourselves. And maybe sometimes we can convince our spouse or partner to change and help us a little bit sometimes too. But that is a very, very limited support structure for carrying all of the responsibilities needed to support a life, especially a life with children. You need to have more than yourself or your partner to be able to combine work and rest and caregiving in a way that's really sustainable. So what can you do to get yourself that time? You know, is it having access to more childcare? Is it building in more community such that, you know, they watch your kids, you watch their kids? Is it trying to think more outside of yourself and in tandem with other people who are trying to do the same things you're trying to do more sustainably? And I think that's what we're overlooking oftentimes when we get so into the self-blame cycle, is that we lose sight of the fact that these struggles are not personal. They are shared because they're a result of these broader structural elements. What we're going through is not an individual issue. It is often something that all women or all mothers are similarly experiencing in some way. And so our greatest resources, sources of information, support systems in trying to shift these things more sustainably is each other. Because even if someone can't come in and watch your kids for you, like, they have probably the institutional knowledge of what it took for them to do it, to get access to that themselves. And so I think what we really need to do with any goal that we have, any barrier to getting more of what we want, is in addition to doing all of these best practices that we've been told or we've been talking about, is try to find more opportunities for tackling these barriers collectively instead of just individually.
That's a great piece of advice. Before we come into our quick fire, I just want to talk about the book. It sounds like an incredible book. Can you just tell everybody what they're going to learn from reading The Ambition Penalty? Sorry, let me say that again. The Ambition Penalty. I can't say penalty. The Ambition Penalty.
The Ambition Penalty, yes. So the subtitle of the book is How Corporate Culture Tells Women to Step Up and Then Pushes Them Down. But as you can tell from this conversation, it's a much more broad subject matter than that, because all of these things we've been talking about, from expectations of what men and women should do versus what power and leadership should look like versus how you advance in the workplace versus how you get access to equitable leisure or opportunity in the home, it's all connected. And what this book really does is expose that. It's very data driven, about 450 citations in the book that expose how many of the barriers to getting these things that we want aren't what we've been told they are. There's something else. There are these gender double standards. They're the fact that, men still have more leisure even though they have access to power and resources. Their gender norms, the thing about paternity leave, and the fact that the status competition among men is the biggest barrier to getting men to come and partake in that earlier caretaking in ways that support women, children, and of course our lives outside of motherhood as well. So what I really hope the book does is not just provide a lot more clarity to people about what's actually standing in our way, but in each chapter I also talk through policies and solutions that are effective in closing many of these gaps and equalizing a lot of these opportunities. And when we're talking about what it's going to take to rebuild this world across our homes, across our workplaces, across our world, I think each of these chapters and the solution sections are a roadmap to what we need to start doing, again, collectively and not just individually, to create and reimagine this new future.
I love this. I'm definitely going to give this a very big read. Read it too. So thank you so much. Stefanie, we're going to run into our quick fire round. Are you ready?
I'm so bad at being concise, but I'm going to do my best.
Amazing. What is one product you swear by?
I love moisturizer, so boring, but must have basic Cetaphil moisturizer because otherwise my skin wants to crack off my face.
Love it. Coffee or matcha?
Coffee.
Well done. What's one habit that helps you feel more organized or grounded?
Running, although speaking of things I don't do enough recently with this book coming out, running is the thing.
I bet running around New York City is lovely at this time of year.
Yes, I live two blocks north of Central Park, and it's just the best. My favorite. It never gets old.
What is your current favorite AI tool or app, and how does it help you?
Oh, one of my favorite things to do, because I use so much research in my work, is I have a tendency to write very academically. And so sometimes if I'm getting too wordy or just like too intellectual and academic about it, I'll say, AI, rewrite this sentence for a 5th grade reading level. And I don't usually typically wind up using it, but the tone clicks something in my head and it says, here's what you're actually saying in a way that doesn't sound like you're writing as a college professor.
I love that. Amazing. What app do you use for that?
I've used ChatGPT and Claude. Yeah.
To be fair, ChatGPT is my lifeline. I use it all the time. One business or motherhood hack that you couldn't live without?
Childcare.
Agreed.
I'm sure everybody says it, but my goodness.
So true. What is your go-to wellness ritual that is under 10 minutes?
So running is over 10 minutes. Under 10 minutes. Calling a friend.
Yeah.
Which sometimes is over 10 minutes, but
sure.
it doesn't have to, it can be under and still be effective.
Exactly. Very effective. And then what's the single most powerful thing that has helped you either in family life or business life?
Coming back to the friends, I really think I found a group of my people, I'll call them, who really understood me and saw me for the kind of work I wanted to do later in my career, in my early 30s. And I think we also all became mothers around the same time. And that is, we don't live near each other, but we get on the phone about once a week. And it's completely changed my life for the better.
Oh, I love that. That makes me happy. That makes me happy.
It makes me happy too. The book is dedicated to them.
Oh, I love it. And Stefanie, for anyone who wants to reach out to you personally or buy the book, where can they find you and buy?
Yes, I'm most active on social media, Instagram specifically, at Stefanie O'Connell. And the book, again, is The Ambition Penalty, How Corporate Culture Tells Women to Step Up and Then Pushes Them Down, wherever you get your books.
I will link everything in the show notes. So guys, if you want to reach out to Stefanie and have any questions or you want to read her book, just check down there and you will find all the details. Stefanie, you've been incredible. Thank you for taking your time this morning to chat to us. It's been such a pleasure.
It was so much fun to talk about this with you. And I feel now you really did kick off my day productively, inspirationally. I feel like I'm set up now.
Yay, love that. Thank you so much, Stefanie. You've been incredible. Love.